The Great Gnome Heist. Chapter 1. A Gnome Day in Willow Creek. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday in Willow Creek, or so it seemed. The sun peeked over the horizon, casting a warm glow on the quaint houses lining Maple Street. Birds chirped their morning melodies, and the smell of freshly cut grass wafted through the air. But something was amiss in this picturesque scene, something that would soon throw the entire town into a tizzy. Mrs. Abernathy, a sprightly octogenarian with a penchant for gardening and gossip, was the first to notice. She stepped out onto her porch, ready to water her prized petunias, when she let out a shriek that could have woken the dead. "My gnomes! My precious gnomes! They're gone!" Her cry echoed down the street, causing curtains to twitch and doors to open. Neighbors emerged from their homes, rubbing sleep from their eyes and wondering what could have possibly upset old Mrs. Abernathy this time. But as they gathered on their own lawns, a chorus of gasps and exclamations filled the air. For it wasn't just Mrs. Abernathy's gnomes that had vanished. All across Willow Creek, garden gnomes had disappeared without a trace. Mr. Johnson's fishing gnome? Gone. The Petersons' golfing gnome trio? Vanished. Even Mayor Betty Bumble's prized collection of historical figure gnomes had been snatched from her elaborately landscaped front yard. Within hours, the Willow Creek Police Department was inundated with calls. Officer Donut, yes, that was his real name, much to his chagrin, found himself drowning in reports of missing gnomes. His desk was piled high with hastily filled out forms describing gnomes of all shapes and sizes. "I'm telling you, Chief," Officer Donut said, his mustache twitching with frustration. "This is bigger than anything we've ever dealt with. It's a gnome-napping epidemic." Chief Wiggum, no relation to the cartoon character, though he'd heard all the jokes, sighed heavily, his chair creaking under his substantial weight. "Donut, it's just a bunch of garden ornaments. Probably some kids playing a prank." But as the day wore on and more reports flooded in, even the skeptical Chief Wiggum had to admit that this was no ordinary case. By nightfall, the gnome-nappings had made the evening news, and Willow Creek found itself at the center of a media frenzy. Mayor Betty Bumble, never one to miss an opportunity for dramatics, called an emergency town meeting. The community center was packed to the rafters with concerned citizens, all chattering about the mysterious disappearances. "My fellow Willow Creekers," Mayor Bumble began, her voice quivering with what she hoped was perceived as righteous indignation. "We are facing a crisis of unprecedented proportions. Our beloved gnomes, those stalwart guardians of our gardens, have been cruelly taken from us." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "I assure you," she continued, warming to her theme, "that no stone will be left unturned, no garden bed unexamined, until we bring our gnomes home." As applause filled the room, Mayor Bumble's assistant leaned in and whispered something in her ear. The mayor's eyes widened, and she quickly added, "And to ensure that no leaf is left unturned in this investigation, I have decided to bring in outside help. We need a detective with a nose for the unusual, someone who can think outside the box. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Harold McGuffin, Private Eye." The crowd turned as one to see a man stumble onto the stage, nearly tripping over his own feet. Harold McGuffin was not what anyone would call an impressive figure. His trench coat was at least 2 sizes too big, his fedora was slightly askew, and he had a perpetual look of mild confusion on his face. Thank you," Harold said, tipping his hat and nearly losing it in the process. "I assure you, good people of Willow Creek, that I will get to the bottom of this gnome-drum. Conundrum. The culprits will be brought to justice, or my name isn't Harold McGuffin." As he struck what he thought was a heroic pose, a ginger cat sauntered onto the stage and sat at his feet, looking for all the world like it was judging everyone in the room. "Oh, and this is my assistant, Whiskers," Harold added, as if it was perfectly normal for a detective to have a feline sidekick. Little did the good people of Willow Creek know, but they were in for the most bizarre, hilarious, and gnome-filled adventure of their lives. Chapter 2: The Game is a Gnome. The following morning, Harold MacGuffin stood in front of the mirror in his rented room above Willow Creek's only diner, practicing his most serious detective face. He squinted, furrowed his brow, and muttered, "The gnome is afoot," in what he imagined was a gravelly, world-weary voice. Whiskers, curled up on the bed, opened one eye and gave a soft meow that sounded suspiciously like a sigh. Now, Whiskers," Harold said, adjusting his fedora for the umpteenth time, "we must approach this case with the utmost seriousness. The fate of Willow Creek's gnome population rests in our capable hands. And pause," he added, glancing at the cat. Whiskers yawned and stretched, clearly unimpressed by Harold's theatrics. As they made their way downstairs, the diner's owner, a jovial woman named Mabel, called out, "Mornin', detective! Ready to crack the case?" "Indeed I am, madam," Harold replied, puffing out his chest. "Evildoers beware, for Harold MacGuffin is on the prowl." He strode purposefully towards the door, only to walk straight into it. Rubbing his nose, he fumbled with the handle before finally making it outside, Whiskers slinking out behind him with feline grace. Their first stop was Mrs. Abernathy's house, ground zero for the great Gnome Heist. The old lady was waiting on her porch, a floral handkerchief clutched in her gnarled hands. "Oh, Detective MacGuffin," she warbled as Harold approached. "I'm so glad you're here." "My poor gnomes, they must be so frightened." Harold nodded solemnly. "Fear not, Mrs. Abernathy. I'll find your gnomes if it's the last thing I do. Now tell me everything you remember about the night they disappeared." As Mrs. Abernathy launched into a long-winded tale about her evening routine, which seemed to involve a lot of herbal tea and reruns of Murder, She Wrote, Harold diligently took notes. Or at least, he thought he was taking notes. In reality, his pen had run out of ink, and he was just making scratching noises on his notepad. Whiskers, meanwhile, had begun to investigate the garden. The cat's keen eyes spotted something glinting in the grass near where the gnomes had stood. He batted at it with his paw, revealing a small button. "And then," Mrs. Abernathy was saying, "I thought I heard a noise like someone giggling. But when I looked out the window, I didn't see anyone. Just a shadow moving near my rose bushes." Harold's eyes lit up. "Aha! A clue!" he exclaimed, startling Mrs. Abernathy so badly she nearly toppled off her rocking chair. "The culprit must have been hiding in your rose bushes." "Ingenious!" He rushed over to the rose bushes, oblivious to Whiskers' attempts to draw his attention to the button. With great ceremony, Harold began to examine the bushes, getting himself thoroughly scratched in the process. "Ouch! Ow! These thorns are quite sharp, Mrs. Abernathy," he called out, his voice muffled as he had somehow managed to get his head stuck in the middle of a bush. Whiskers watched this display with what could only be described as feline exasperation. The cat picked up the button in his mouth and dropped it at Mrs. Abernathy's feet. "Oh my!" the old lady said, bending down with a creak of arthritic joints. "What's this? A button?" Harold, who had finally extracted himself from the rose bush, leaves and twigs stuck in his hair, rushed over. "What's that? A button? Well done, Mrs. Abernathy. Your keen eyes have spotted our first real clue." He plucked the button from her hand, holding it up to the light. Yes, very interesting. This button clearly belonged to the perpetrator. It must have come loose during the dastardly deed. Whiskers let out a meow that sounded remarkably like a groan. Now, Mrs. Abernathy, Harold said, pocketing the button, did you happen to notice any suspicious characters in the neighborhood recently? Anyone new in town, perhaps? Mrs. Abernathy's eyes lit up. Well, now that you mention it, there is that new family that moved in down the street. The Johnsons, I think. They have a teenage boy who's always skulking about. And you know how teenagers are these days. Harold nodded sagely, as if he had any idea how teenagers were these days. Indeed, indeed. Well, Mrs. Abernathy, you've been most helpful. Rest assured, we're hot on the trail of your gnome-nappers. As they left Mrs. Abernathy's garden, Harold strutted down the sidewalk, feeling quite pleased with himself. You see, Whiskers, he said to the cat trotting alongside him. That's how real detective works. Gathering clues, interrogating witnesses, piecing together the puzzle. Why, I wouldn't be surprised if we cracked this case by lunchtime. Whiskers, who had actually found the only real clue so far, merely flicked his tail in response. Their next stop was the Johnson residence. As they approached the house, Harold attempted to look stealthy, which mainly involved him hunching his shoulders and taking exaggerated tiptoe steps. He looked less like a detective and more like a cartoon character trying to sneak past a sleeping guard. The door was opened by a harried-looking woman with a toddler on her hip. Yes? She asked, eyeing Harold's disheveled appearance warily. Harold whipped out a magnifying glass from his pocket, nearly dropping it in the process, and held it up to his eye, which made it look comically large. Good morning, madam. I'm Detective Harold McGuffin, and I'm investigating the recent gnome-nappings. Might I have a word with your son? Mrs. Johnson blinked in confusion. My son? He's only 2, she said, bouncing the toddler on her hip. Now it was Harold's turn to look confused. But Mrs. Abernathy said you had a teenage boy who was always skulking about. Mrs. Abernathy? Mrs. Johnson's expression cleared. Oh, you must mean the Jacksons. They live 2 doors down. They're the ones with the teenage son. Harold's face reddened. Ah, yes, of course. Simple misunderstanding. Well, thank you for your time, Mrs. Johnson. Keep an eye out for any suspicious gnome activity. As they walked away, Harold muttered to Whiskers, Well, that was a bit embarrassing. But fear not, my feline friend. A small setback won't deter Harold McGuffin. Whiskers, who had been watching a suspicious movement in the bushes across the street, meowed insistently. But Harold, caught up in his own thoughts, didn't notice. Instead, he marched on towards the Jackson house, ready to interrogate his first real suspect. Little did he know, the real culprits were much closer than he thought, and far more numerous than anyone in Willow Creek could have imagined. Chapter 3: Gnome Man's Land. As Harold approached the Jackson residence, he rehearsed his interrogation techniques under his breath. So, young man, where were you on the night of the great gnome disappearance? Don't try to pull the wool over my eyes. I've got eyes like a hawk and the tenacity of a bulldog. Whiskers, padding along beside him, rolled his eyes in a remarkably human-like fashion. Harold rapped smartly on the door, then struck what he believed to be an intimidating pose. The door opened to reveal a lanky teenager with shaggy hair and a bored expression. Yeah? The boy said, barely looking up from his phone. Harold thrust his magnifying glass forward, nearly poking the teen in the eye. Aha! I've caught you red-handed, you nefarious gnome-napper! The boy jerked back, finally looking up with a mixture of confusion and annoyance. What the heck, dude? Don't play coy with me, young man, Harold continued, warming to his theme. I know all about your skulking ways. Now, confess. Where have you hidden the gnomes? Gnomes? What gnomes? The boy asked, his brow furrowed. And who are you? Harold deflated slightly, realizing he might have jumped the gun. I'm Detective Harold MacGuffin, he said, trying to regain his authoritative tone. I'm investigating the disappearance of garden gnomes all over Willow Creek. Your name came up as a person of interest. The teenager snorted. Seriously? You think I stole a bunch of lame garden gnomes? I've got better things to do with my time, like, literally anything else. Harold's confidence wavered. But Mrs. Abernathy said you were always skulking about. Mrs. Abernathy? That old lady down the street? Dude, I was walking my dog. That's not skulking, that's just walking. As if on cue, a large, friendly-looking dog bounded up to the door, tail wagging. It immediately took an interest in Whiskers, who arched his back and hissed. See? The boy said, gesturing to the dog. This is Max. We go for walks every day. No gnome-napping involved. Harold deflated further. I see. Well, thank you for your time. And if you do happen to see any suspicious gnome activity, please don't hesitate to contact the authorities. As they walked away from the Jackson house, Harold's shoulders slumped. Well, Whiskers, it seems we've hit a dead end. Perhaps this case is more complex than I initially thought. Whiskers meowed in what sounded suspiciously like agreement. Their investigation continued throughout the day, with Harold questioning various residents of Willow Creek. He interrogated the local gardener, who seemed more concerned about the state of his petunias than missing gnomes. He grilled the postman, convinced that he must have seen something on his rounds he hadn't. He even attempted to interview a squirrel, much to Whiskers' embarrassment. By late afternoon, Harold was no closer to solving the mystery than when he started. Discouraged, he decided to take a break and headed to the local park to clear his head. The park was unusually quiet for a sunny afternoon. Harold slumped onto a bench, while Whiskers curled up at his feet. Oh, Whiskers, Harold sighed. Maybe I'm not cut out for this detective business after all. I haven't found a single solid lead. What am I missing? As if in answer to his question, a high-pitched giggle echoed from somewhere nearby. Harold sat up straight, his detective instincts, such as they were, suddenly on high alert. Did you hear that, Whiskers? He whispered excitedly. It sounded just like Mrs. Abernathy described. The giggling she heard on the night of the gnome-napping. Whiskers' ears perked up, and he looked intently towards a cluster of bushes near the park's edge. Harold, following the cat's gaze, noticed a slight movement among the leaves. Aha! He exclaimed, leaping to his feet. The culprit returns to the scene of the crime. Without a second thought, Harold charged towards the bushes, arms outstretched. I've got you now, you gnome-napping and ne'er-do-well. He dove into the shrubbery with all the grace of a hippopotamus doing ballet. There was a lot of rustling, a yelp of surprise that was distinctly not Harold's, and then a triumphant shout as he emerged, clutching a squirming figure by the collar. Gotcha! Harold declared, holding up a young boy who couldn't have been more than 12. The boy's eyes were wide with fear, and he was covered in leaves and twigs. Let me go! The boy shouted, struggling in Harold's grip. Not until you tell me where you've hidden the gnomes, Harold said, trying to sound menacing but only managing to sound slightly out of breath. The boy stopped struggling and looked at Harold with confusion. Gnomes? What are you talking about? Harold's face fell. You mean You're not the gnome-napper? The boy shook his head vigorously. No! I was just playing hide and seek with my friends. Harold released the boy, who immediately bolted back into the bushes. Sorry about that, Harold called after him, feeling more than a little foolish. Whiskers, who had been watching the whole scene with a look of feline amusement, meowed softly. Yes, I know, Harold muttered, brushing leaves off his coat. Another dead end. But we're not giving up yet, Whiskers. The gnome-napper is out there somewhere, and we're going to find them. As they left the park, Harold's mind was racing. He had exhausted all his leads and still had no idea who was behind the gnome thefts. But he was determined to solve the case, no matter how long it took. Chapter 4: A Break in the Case. The next morning, Harold was woken by the sound of his phone ringing. He groggily reached for it, knocking over a stack of books in the process. Hello? He mumbled, still half asleep. Detective MacGuffin? Came the voice on the other end. This is Chief Wiggum. We've got a break in the case. You need to get down to the station right away. Harold's eyes snapped open. On my way, he said, scrambling out of bed and nearly tripping over Whiskers, who was curled up at the foot of the bed. He arrived at the police station in record time, his coat buttoned up wrong and his hat askew. Chief Wiggum was waiting for him, looking slightly bemused. Glad you could make it, MacGuffin, the chief said. We've had a tip-off from one of the local kids. Says he saw a group of teenagers hanging around the park last night with a bunch of garden gnomes. Harold's eyes lit up. The gnome gang! I knew it! Chief Wiggum raised an eyebrow. But what now? Never mind, Harold said quickly. Just tell me where I can find these teenagers. The chief handed him a piece of paper with an address on it. They've been seen hanging around this old abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. Be careful, MacGuffin. We don't know what we're dealing with here. Harold nodded, feeling a surge of excitement. This was it. The break he'd been waiting for. He and Whiskers were going to crack this case wide open. Chapter 5: The Gnome Gang. The warehouse was a dilapidated building with broken windows and graffiti-covered walls. Harold approached cautiously, Whiskers at his side. Stay close, Whiskers, Harold whispered. We don't know what we're walking into. They crept around the side of the building, peering through a broken window. Inside, they could see a group of teenagers sitting around a makeshift table, playing cards. And there, in the corner, was a pile of garden gnomes. Aha! Harold whispered triumphantly. We've found the stash. He straightened up, ready to burst in and make a dramatic arrest, but Whiskers had other ideas. The cat darted through the broken window, landing silently on the warehouse floor. Whiskers! Wait! Harold hissed, but it was too late. The cat was already making his way towards the pile of gnomes. Harold had no choice but to follow. He clambered through the window, landing with a thud that immediately drew the attention of the teenagers. Hey! Who are you? One of them shouted, jumping to his feet. Harold tried to strike a heroic pose. I'm Detective Harold MacGuffin, and you're all under arrest for the theft of garden gnomes. The teenagers looked at each other, then burst out laughing. Garden gnomes? Seriously? One of them said, wiping tears of laughter from his eyes. Harold's face turned red. Yes, seriously. Now, hand over the gnomes and come quietly, or I'll. Or you'll what? Another teenager taunted. Call the gnome police? The group laughed even harder, and Harold felt his confidence slipping away. But then, Whiskers let out a loud yowl, drawing everyone's attention to the pile of gnomes. "What's the cat doing?" one of the teenagers asked, frowning. Whiskers had his paw on one of the gnomes, and he was looking at Harold expectantly. Harold took a deep breath and walked over to the pile. He picked up the gnome Whiskers had indicated and turned it over in his hands. "What's this?" he muttered, noticing a small latch on the bottom of the gnome. He flipped the latch, and the gnome's head popped open, revealing a hollow interior filled with small plastic bags. Harold's eyes widened. "Drugs? These gnomes are being used to smuggle drugs." The teenager's laughter died instantly, replaced by looks of panic. "Oh," one of them muttered. "We are so busted." Harold turned to face them, feeling a surge of triumph. "That's right. You're all under arrest for drug smuggling." The teenagers didn't wait to be arrested. They bolted for the door, but Harold was ready. He pulled out a whistle and blew it, and within seconds, Chief Wiggum and his officers burst into the warehouse, blocking the exits. "Nice work, MacGuffin," the chief said, clapping Harold on the back. "Looks like you cracked the case after all." Harold beamed. "Thank you, Chief. But I couldn't have done it without Whiskers." The cat, now sitting proudly on top of the pile of gnomes, meowed in agreement. Chapter 6: A Hero's Welcome. The news of the gnome smuggling ring's bust spread like wildfire through Willow Creek. Harold MacGuffin became an overnight hero, and Whiskers was hailed as the town's cleverest cat. Mayor Betty Bumble organized a special ceremony in the town square to honor Harold and Whiskers. The entire town turned out for the event, eager to celebrate the return of their beloved gnomes. "Today, we honor Detective Harold MacGuffin and his remarkable cat, Whiskers," Mayor Bumble announced from the stage. "Thanks to their bravery and determination, our gnomes are safe, and a dangerous smuggling ring has been brought to justice." The crowd erupted in applause as Harold and Whiskers took the stage. Harold tried to look modest, but he couldn't hide his pride. "Thank you, everyone," he said, tipping his hat. "It was a tough case, but with Whiskers by my side, we knew we could crack it. And remember, if you ever need a detective, you know who to call." Whiskers meowed loudly, as if to say, "Don't forget about me." The crowd laughed and cheered, and Harold felt a warm glow of satisfaction. He had finally proven himself as a detective, and he knew that with Whiskers by his side, there was no mystery they couldn't solve. Epilogue: The next adventure. Life in Willow Creek soon returned to normal, but Harold and Whiskers were never short of new cases to solve. Whether it was finding a missing pet, uncovering a secret recipe, or tracking down a lost heirloom, the dynamic duo was always ready for their next adventure. And as for the gnomes, they were returned to their rightful owners, who made sure to keep a closer eye on them from then on. Mrs. Abernathy even installed a security camera in her garden, just in case. As Harold and Whiskers strolled through the town one sunny afternoon, Harold couldn't help but smile. He had found his calling, and he knew that with Whiskers by his side, there was no mystery too great, no puzzle too complex, and no case too bizarre for the great detective team of MacGuffin and Whiskers. The end.
Subscribe for more.